I come to you from Washington, D.C. I apologize for that, but it's really good to be here in the heart of American manufacturing at this conference full of people who want to reindustrialize America. The conversations taking place here are what will ensure that we achieve the manufacturing renaissance that our country desperately needs right now. And any successful movement like this has core participants, so I of course want to start by thanking some of those. Thank you, of course, to the Reindustrialize team for putting together such a unique and historic gathering. I want to call attention to the efforts of Austin Bishop and Kate Moon. This couldn't have happened without them, so thanks for that. And thanks to everyone in this room. You are at the front lines of what I think is a generational project to reindustrialize America. And frankly, I think time is really short. I think we're long overdue for this. I think we're past time. During my career, I found that most radical change and huge shift in approach comes down really to a small group of people who are motivated and, in my view, inspired, frankly, to do things that other people don't think to do, but you motivate people to do it. And I expect this group to be that group of people to motivate the rest of the country. And I want to thank the city of Detroit for hosting the conference, of course. Detroit and other cities like it has been a participant in what has been I think, tumultuous journey to industrialization and to the brink, and hopefully now our way back. And how we got to the brink, why we can't let that happen again, and how the Trump administration's trade policy is bringing manufacturing back is what I want to talk about today with you. So during the heyday of American industrialization, our country enjoyed a robust middle class, an unassailable national defense, and an innovation economy unprecedented in human history. I'm not really appealing to nostalgia, that's always fun, but this is real. This is really how it was, and Detroit and other cities like it made that possible. Ford's plant here alone employed over 75,000 workers in the late 1940s. These workers not only earned a good living, but they had the opportunity to build a good life too for their families. They could afford the cars that they crafted out of cold metal, and the enormous and widespread demand for work provided long-awaited opportunities for Americans of every color and every creed. And their promissory note for the American dream, it wasn't signed on paper, but it was forged in steel. It was stamped, made in the USA. But what these workers didn't know was happening, initially at least, is that change was afoot beyond our borders and allowed by, and even encouraged by, folks in Washington. Foreign countries wanted in on the benefits provided by industrialization and the innovation brought by the United States. And to achieve that, foreign governments often adopted policies to give their businesses an unfair advantage, from subsidies to wage suppression to lax regulations and environmental rules. These foreign economic policies started a decades-long experiment in market distortion, the likes of which is just unparalleled in history. Just as an example, I'll cite South Korea, who is a great partner and a great ally of the United States, and they make so much steel there. Is it because in Korea they have iron ore or energy or coal or anything like that? No, it's because they had years and years of subsidies and industrial policy to do this. And frankly, that's what I would have done if I was Korea too. But it created enormous challenges for our own industry, and I just give that as an example. Many, many countries did that as well. And unfortunately, economic elites in Washington and on Wall Street realized that they could make a buck from this type of unfair competition. They could take their share off the top of this arbitrage. And the result were successive rounds of what I would call non-strategic trade liberalization. There are probably times when trade liberalization makes sense. We should be pragmatic about it, but this was non-strategic. And at the end of all of this, we created the World Trade Organization, we had NAFTA, and while there were some beneficiaries to these, there were a lot of losers, and a lot of them were right here in the industrial heartland of the United States. These policies, they set UF tariff rates below those of our major trading partners. These agreements failed to correct the systemic asymmetries in the global economy that jeopardized our competitiveness in the globe. And so what was the result? It was an ever-increasing trade deficit in goods and waves of offshoring. Some people will complain about, when I invoke the trade deficit in goods or the president talks about it, But these are typically people who are making money on both sides of the border, so they don't care. If you're a giant multinational, you don't care where your bottom line is coming from as long as you're making money. But if you're a welder in Detroit or you're making autos in Ohio, you care where that money's coming from because it's either your job or someone else in another country. And so due to this trade deficit the United States lost, or as a result of, the United States lost about 5 million manufacturing jobs and about 100,000 factories in the years before President Trump's first election in 2016. It was very popular, of course, to argue for unfettered free trade. Jack Welch, of course, then the CEO of General Electric, he was a big proponent. In 1988, he suggested that in an ideal world, every factory would be on a barge, floating, and you could move it to different parts of the world to take advantage of wage and regulatory arbitrage. Of course, American workers, families, and communities, they weren't on that barge. They weren't part of this vision. And since then, I would say that Jack Welch has gotten a pretty close approximation of the barge. And while America and its manufacturing industry and its workers, they got decline. That's what they got. And President Trump, he summed it up pretty well, when he's been on the campaign trail, when he says it used to be that cars were made in Flint and you couldn't drink the water in Mexico. Now the cars are made in Mexico and you can't drink the water in Flint. Now today, we have a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods. It almost sounds like monopoly money. I mean, this is the largest trade deficit in goods of any country in human history on planet Earth. And it's financed by the largest debt burden of any country ever. It's untenable. It's a state of affairs that is as unsustainable as it is unacceptable. Because if you fail to correct this status quo, it means that we're all just complicit in the loss of our industrial base, even more than we've already lost it. And a country without robust manufacturing is hardly a country at all. I think you'd agree with me on that. But let's talk about that just a little bit. So in taking our economy to the brink, American policymakers and leaders of business, they forgot something very basic and fundamental. America, like any country, it's not just a country of consumers that want cheap stuff. It's a country of producers, fundamentally. You produce so you can create wealth, you can obtain what you need so you can consume, but also so you can support your family, support your community, support your country. That was forgotten. And a robust manufacturing sector ensures socioeconomic success, protects our national security, and rewards our economy with innovation. So I want to talk about each of these 3 points. First, manufacturing strengthens the economic foundation of our communities. So this is really from a domestic perspective, why it's important to have manufacturing. A production economy, what I would call a production economy, is an economy with the wage growth and social mobility and stability that supports a broad middle class, especially for those who haven't graduated from college or don't have a college degree. And this, in my view, this necessarily means that manufacturing is going to play a key role. A recent study found that typical restaurant workers make 35% more if they go into a comparably skilled job at an average factory. And they'll make double if they go to work in some of the most advanced factories. What's interesting is this is more than if they go into healthcare, where they would see a 19% raise, or even finance, where they'd see a 32% raise. So this is interesting because you always hear these ideas that, Americans don't want factory jobs, and these are jobs that we should send overseas, but they actually have better pay and benefits than healthcare and even finance in some situations. Manufacturing jobs just overall, they offer better benefits, more career development opportunities, and the promise of stability, which is core for our communities. And they have broader economic benefits for those communities. A new manufacturing job creates, the estimate is 7.4 downstream jobs compared to 2 in healthcare and a mere 1.2 in retail. So it's no surprise then that according to a Cato Institute survey, this is like the only time I'll ever quote the Cato Institute, by the way, but according to a recent survey they did, 1 in 4 American workers would leave their current job for one in manufacturing, right? So right now we have, somewhere between 10 to 12% of the workforce in manufacturing. Maybe it's a little lower than that. But another 25% of Americans would leave their current job to work in manufacturing. Now, most of you here have probably heard of the China shock, which cost America 5 million jobs after we foolishly allowed China to join the World Trade Organization and gave them permanent access to the American market. So what became of those communities most impacted by the China shock a quarter century later, right? We've all heard about the shock, what's happening now. Well, the researchers on this, and again, some of you are probably familiar with this, although employment eventually rebounded in the areas hardest hit in the 2010s by the China shock, the new jobs, they weren't manufacturing jobs. They were primarily in low-wage service work. And this has left those communities poorer, more precarious, and less stable. And importantly, the people getting those new jobs, they were not the ones that lost their old jobs. So this isn't a case of creative destruction and people go from their old job to a more productive and more interesting new job. It's the opposite. The people with the old jobs just lost those jobs. The replacement jobs weren't as good and different people got them. So it just was the complete opposite of what economists had predicted. And in fact, native-born black and white workers without a college education experienced permanent employment declines. Those workers did not leave to find better jobs elsewhere. They didn't become a home health nurse in Phoenix. They didn't do any of that because they're people, right? They want to be where they grew up. They want to be by their family. They want the kind of job that they can stick around and build a community with. So instead what happened, they got stuck. They fell out of the workforce, and in many cases into a cycle of despair. And we all know about fentanyl and drug abuse and all these different kinds of things. But I can tell you, I think that our economic situation, including our international trade situation, is a factor in that. In fact, young and middle-aged American men are less likely to be working now than at any time in modern US history, with the labor force participation rate for prime-aged men at the lowest it has been in the last 100 years. I hear people say, well, Jamieson, if we bring back factories or we reshore, who's going to do the jobs? It's these people. It's these people who have fallen out of the workforce. That's who has to do it. Just by way of comparison, of the baby boomer generation, when that generation was 25, only 7% of the baby boomers were not working. Today, 14% of millennials are out of the workforce at that same age, double. We just can't accept a society where the young adults, or in many cases the other adults, are out of the workforce. We have to create a society where individuals can find a good job in their hometown, a job that provides prosperity, purpose, and dignity. And so we just have to have a manufacturing sector to meet this vital need. Now that's just on the domestic and socioeconomic side. Manufacturing is essential to ensuring our national security, and I know a lot of you here know that and believe that. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, FDR told Congress the following. He said, "Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced." He said, "It is not enough to turn out just a few more planes, a few more tanks, a few more guns, a few more ships than can be turned out by our enemies. We must outproduce them overwhelmingly so that there can be no question of our ability to provide a crushing superiority of equipment in any theater of war." How's that for a call to arms for the industry? Yep. And outproduce them we did. Bethlehem Steel, for example, on its own, made more steel than the entire Axis powers combined. Over the course of the war, the U.S. built more than 3,600 cargo ships and 1,300 naval vessels. By comparison, last year, the United States built just 5 ocean-going commercial ships. It's embarrassing and dangerous. Estimates suggest that China's shipbuilding capacity exceeds ours by more than 200 times. It didn't have to be this way. That's what's so frustrating, is it didn't have to be this way. In the late 1970s, the United States was the second largest commercial shipbuilder in the world. Now we make less than half of 1% of the world's commercial ships. The Trump administration is taking action across the federal government to try to reverse this. As part of this effort, my office, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, took an action on shipbuilding, which will levy fees on certain foreign-made ships to help create a demand signal to spur new investment into America's commercial shipyards. We need to do more, but it's a start. And just like how commercial ship production can catalyze naval ship production, a vibrant industrial base supports our defense industrial base. It gives us a surge capacity we need to ramp up production in a crisis. For example, although the United States possessed almost no domestic production of personal protective equipment before COVID-19, our apparel and textile factories were able to modify their operations to produce the masks and gowns we needed. Similarly, the ability of the U.S. to ramp up vaccine production through Operation Warp Speed was incredibly successful. Without these baseline industrial capabilities for strategic goods, fighting the pandemic, let alone a war, would be impossible. And I would just note, the more challenging the world becomes and the more hostile our foes become, the more goods become strategic in nature. Things that we may not have thought of before, like fertilizer and even textiles, we don't normally think of those as strategic, but they are. And in fact, the closer you get to conflict, maybe the more important they become. So it's not just about the advanced tech or highest tech goods, it's about the low tech stuff that provides the very basis of our economy. The best thing for our allies across the world is for America to have a strong industrial base, especially if they expect that industrial base to come to their defense in times of crisis and war. We recently sent Stinger anti-air missiles to Ukraine. We had to scramble to bring back 70-year-old retired engineers to restart our dormant production lines. More recently, a Chinese chokehold on rare earth magnets has galvanized the country to action, including through direct government investment in MP materials. We simply don't have time to wait, and we have to have an active industrial policy, or we'll be forced to take other people's. Finally, manufacturing, I think, is an underappreciated driver of innovation and productivity growth. The legendary former head of CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, he explained that manufacturing, including that of so-called commodity products, builds the chain of experience that is so important in technological evolution. Let me just give you a couple of figures that give me concern. Between 2003 and 2017, R&D expenditures in China by U.S. multinationals grew at an average rate of 13.6% per year. That's U.S. companies in China. While R&D investment by U.S. companies in the United States grew by an average of just 5% per year. 13.6% in China, 5% in the United States. That disparity is very troubling to me. If we can't produce here, we're going to lose the ability to design here as well. Innovation follows manufacturing, right? I think we all understand that. But manufacturing, it punches above its weight when it comes to R&D and innovation. So U.S. manufacturing right now contributes about 11% of GDP. But the sector makes up 20% of capital investment, 35% of productivity growth, and 70% of business R&D spending. 70%. That's incredible. I think that those who want to rationalize the status quo, they like to take comfort with the myth that all we've lost is this low-cost manufacturing, and we can rest easy knowing that we have an advanced manufacturing edge. But I think we all know that we're losing that too, both basic manufacturing and advanced. And I think also sometimes our productivity gains are a little overstated just by the way we calculate it. If you take out some of the supercomputers we still make here and some of the memory chips, et cetera, you can see that when you look at our real productivity growth, it's not inspiring. When it comes to robots, we barely cut the top 10 of countries based on robot density in our manufacturing base. We have 295 robots per 10,000 workers. China has 470, Korea over 1,000. I think that ultimately the way the international trade system is set up, it doesn't reward investment in manufacturing productivity. Instead, it encourages a race to the bottom. The system is designed to encourage firms to compete on labor and regulatory arbitrage. This is what Vice President Vance recently referred to as an addiction to cheap labor. Again, this is Jack Welch's floating barge, going to find cheap labor, not looking for productivity growth in the classic sense. This is hardly real comparative advantage. I have a lot to say, but like the clock is ticking, and when you do congressional hearings, like the clock ticks, then it turns red, and then you have to stop. So I'm going to try to beat the red light. I think what I want people to understand is that our industrial base, it wasn't lost overnight. It's not going to be restored overnight, but failure to do so is not an option, and that's why President Trump and his team have moved quickly and decisively. He declared a national emergency with respect to the trade deficit and the implications that it has for our industrial base. As I'm sure you know, the president has imposed a 10% tariff on everybody to get at the trade deficit issue. And for the most problematic countries, they have a higher rate. China has the highest cumulative rate of tariff at about 55%. Of course, the president signaled a willingness to negotiate with countries if they want to have an alternative relation with us and really join us in reindustrializing. And countries have been responsive. And The president's been sending out letters. You may have seen this. He's sending letters to countries telling them, here's what your tariff's going to be unless we have some alternative arrangement. But there's an important comment in the letter from the president, which, by the way, he drafted himself, right? This is something he dictates in the Oval Office to me and his other aides. And he had a line in there that says, there will be no tariff if you decide to build or manufacture product within the United States. On top of his reciprocal tariff program, the president has initiated investigations and imposed tariffs on very key sectors, steel, aluminum, autos, copper, lumber. Just recently, they announced investigations of drones and polysilicon, things where we have to be leaders or we'll just be followers. And I'm pretty confident that these will succeed because we have data, right? You hear economists make predictions, but then you have data. In the first term, we imposed historic tariffs on China. The net result is our trade deficit with China went down. Our dependence on China went down. Our real median household income went up during the first term, having this kind of robust trade policy. And it's not a new kind of trade policy. Alexander Hamilton advocated for tariffs. Henry Clay's American system focused on a protective tariff. This is something that has been part of American fabric for a long time. It's really the past 25 or 30 years that have been the exception rather than the rule. You probably all are familiar with President Reagan's very pragmatic restrictions on imported autos of Japanese companies. And then those Japanese companies came here. They employ 100,000 workers or more, and they're in the fabric of the American industrial base, and we're grateful to have them. So we know these types of policies can work. I would say that this has been a priority of President Trump his entire life. He's always talked about it. As I mentioned, in his first term, we focused on it. We put tariffs on China. And the new expanded tariff programs are already bearing fruit. GM is investing $4 billion over the next 2 years to increase U.S. output and moving production of two popular models from Mexico back to the United States. Steel companies are opening up new furnaces and lines from Ohio to Louisiana. Generic and branded pharmaceuticals have announced billions of dollars in investment. So things are working, things are moving. We're only a few months in, and we're already seeing a huge outcome from all of this. I just want you to understand some of the end game here. Sometimes you have a U.S. trade representative, and they say, what's your goal? And they say, I want to have a trade deal with X country and X country by the time I've done. That's not how I think about it. I have three goals. One, I want to reverse the trend of our global trade deficit in goods and keep it decreasing over time. Second, I want to increase real median household income in the U.S. And third, I want to increase manufacturing share of GDP. Trade and tariff, it's not the only tool. We just passed the one big beautiful bill with R&D expensing, capital expensing. We've invested in Mountain Pass, as you all know. We have a competitive energy policy. I mean, at the end of the day, we just have to be clear-eyed about the challenge before us. But I think that you all are ready for the job. I'm not an inventor. I'm not an investor. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer. I'm the U.S. Trade Representative. That means, really my job is to clear the playing field of all the pitfalls, the obstacles, all the unfairness that has hindered U.S. reindustrialization. Your job is really to go out there and score the goal. Only you can build the factory, invent the new technology, train the next generation of workers, because if you don't reindustrialize the country, who will? Just please tell me how I can help. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you very much.